All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Energeia Podcast. This is Dr. G with you again, as always. And today, it is my pleasure to be speaking with James Hemsath. Jim is a managing director and a senior consultant at IntegrityOne, a consultancy practice which specializes in looking how different teams made up of unique and different parties from differing countries and cultures can collaborate together in order to overcome complex problems. He has over 40 years experience managing large projects and economic development in the Arctic region, predominantly in the field of energy. Jim was a member of the United States Department of Energy's Arctic Energy Office, where he managed research projects at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and is a senior fellow at the Institute of the North, where he has developed and led an international polar year project on Arctic energy. Jim is also on the faculty at the University of Alaska Anchorage in the College of Business and Public Policy, where he teaches classes in organizational behavior and applied management, and also sits on advisory boards for the College of Engineering and the Honors College. His research is primarily centered on the area of collaboration, particularly as it relates to shared vision within team environments, and which we will explore in more depth during our discussion today. So Jim, it's great to see you again. It's been a minute. Thank you for so much for joining me today on the podcast from I was going to say the frozen wilds of the mighty North. I've kind of got the seasons back to front there, but thank you for joining me all the way from Alaska today.
Well, Garrett, thank you. And it's not quite frozen. We have been on an odd weather pattern as much as the world is, where over the last 2 months, we've had almost 50 continuous days of rain, of which today is another one. So we went from a very kind of a drought in April, May, and June, and first half of July, and nothing but floods in July and August leading into September. I'm almost ready for snow because at least it's white and it's easy to shovel. But that means the dark.
And it would be more befitting the image that I have of Alaska in my mind. I mean, call me uncultured, but in my mind, I just have frozen tundras and ranked choice voting in my mind. So, whether that's just my superficial impressions of Alaska or not, I guess you'll have to disabuse me of those.
Ranked choice voting has been really interesting. As we just had that experiment just this last month on a special runoff. So the upcoming full-term elections in November should be intriguing. And there's a lot of controversy on it, but in some ways it does allow a better representation and kind of take some of the what's become a more tribal nature of politics out of the situation. I did love the introduction. I wish I was that guy.
Well, perhaps in addition to the introduction of this person you apparently are not, the one that I've just teed you up with there, perhaps you could give our listeners a little bit of insight into your actual career experiences as a practitioner and a scholar alike, and perhaps tell us a little bit about how these experiences have shaped your thinking over these years and perhaps influenced the predominant focus of your interests today.
Well, happy to do that. And I guess there is a checkbox, and you did hit the checkbox of things that I've stepped on, but when someone reads it together, it's a little bit more bigger than I feel. But the kind of going into that, kind of leading off of that introduction, part of who I am, I think, is one about curiosity and lifetime learning. There are multiple degrees that I've kind of chipped along just because I get bored and said maybe it's time for another master's degree. But transformationally, as relating back to our joint experience at Case, getting a doctorate was intriguing to me. It was an amazing challenge, but it did have a purpose. Over the last literally 45 years, my career spans 45 years before I retired a couple of years ago, and now as an adjunct professor of management at the local university. My work tended to derive from the basis of engineering into projects. The question became for me is, how do people work together to get something done? Now, moving into an Arctic environment, especially economic development, some of the potential large projects as a starting point was there's a lot of cost, a lot of distance. It's hard to do things in the Arctic. There's a quote that I'll mangle from the 1895 Alaska Journal of Mining, which says, "Seasons are short, distances are long, fortune is fickle," as a warning to the miners coming up here, because seasons are short. The summer season is very short. Most of the oil and gas development in the North Slope has to take place in a 3-month window when the waters are open to move equipment up and around. Tundra, yes, frozen tundra. Often we have to wait for things to be a hard freeze before we're able to move out in the tundra without doing damage. And as climate change starts to take place, these become a little bit trickier. So coming into the problem of practice that was an interest was simply understanding the context that for projects to get done in the Arctic are going to require multiple parties, multiple entities coming together so they can spin off the risk. They can diffuse the risk in kind of a portfolio manner. And the likelihood is that they're going to come from a variety of different national cultures. In addition, we have our indigenous cultures that are often unrepresented in the work that's being done. So that aspect of transnational multi-party collaboration was the ultimate soundbite of where my research went. And it showed a couple of things that were interesting, but more importantly, it showed a whole lot more questions that I wanted to answer. The things that were interesting is your comment on shared vision, that the quantitative analysis suggested very strongly that shared vision had nothing to do with collaboration. It was not an antecedent, and in fact, shared vision could prevent collaboration from happening. Now, that's kind of where the numbers showed up, and this was 2 weeks before everything was supposed to be done, and I'm going, oh my God, what does that mean? That doesn't make sense. Of course you have to have a shared vision. But I started to think about it in the dynamic of teams, groupthink and teamthink. And when you look at the scales that we're measuring shared vision, the question is, how together is a group? How entered they are in terms of a shared vision? How linear is that shared vision? And when you think of that as a groupthink, what that means is that there's no role for the outlier. There's no place for the outside voice. Collaboration is about that outside voice. It's about finding a way to do something differently. And if you're too locked in to a shared vision, then you don't have the flexibility to do that. So in good parsing of words, as Ron Fry would say back at Case, words create worlds. We modified the findings to that a unified shared vision was an impediment to collaboration. Interestingly enough, Amy Edmondson, the great Harvard scholar on teaming and psychological safety, came out with a book shortly, like a month after I finished my doctorate. And hers book was on a case study. I can't remember the title of the book. It was a short book she had written with a journalist that said, well, on some of these future large projects, we don't really have a grasp of what we need to do. Shared vision is a problem. What we need is an adaptive shared vision. I'm shouting in the office, hey, I could have told you that. All you do is ask, Amy. So that aspect of that flexibility is kind of intriguing. Now, the question is, going forward in that research is, what does that mean? Collaboration, yeah, identity is important. Some aspect of individual versus groupthink is important, so the individual can be heard. Empathy is something that would expect to come up, which says over time, a group of people coming together have to have enough time to share their stories, to create their perspectives, to generate some shared identity, some fused identity. But as I'm moving forward, there's a couple things that kind of jumped out at me saying, there's a little bit more than that. It's not that simple. And I may take exception with every word that I've said for the last 5 years. And it started off with a conference I was at in DC at the National Academy of the Science. It was the Arctic Futures 2050 conference. It was like the last conference before a pandemic. And since I'm retired and only as an adjunct, it was the last conference I could afford to do because I had just retired and still had some money. And it was about what was going on in the Arctic in terms of research. And I had a poster there, but the conference was organized around panel sessions. What was really intriguing is I'm starting to see the dynamic. There are members of the indigenous community in Alaska and Canada in particular. There's always really aggressive and bright researchers from colleges and universities across the United States, none of them Alaskan for the most part, wanting to get in there and find out what climate change is. And you started to hear some comments. The comments were, well, researchers don't respect our traditional knowledge, our indigenous knowledge of the last 10,000 years. You've got $1 million grant to study the Norwegian rat and the impact of climate change on that as a metric, but I need a break wall to prevent coastal erosion from taking place. And I had a small linear model about how one gets to collaboration. And if you look at people, they start off in a conflict type zone. We're fighting different things. And then they get some aspect of commonality, and then they're just what we would call competition, where people are competing for the same prize, but they're not necessarily looking at blood and guts and warfare. And then we want to move to some place where we actually cooperate, which is, in my mind, a negotiated process. And from cooperation, perhaps we can reach collaboration. So in that kind of thought process, cooperation is a negotiated transactional process. Collaboration is an emergent transformational process. You may not get there. You could end up doing a project where everyone signs a contract, they agree to cooperate, they negotiate all the terms, but they're stuck in trying to find out what size piece of pie do I get. Now I'm hearing these conversations and I'm going, oh my God, we're still in the conflict. We're not even in the competition. There is direct conflict with the locals and the indigenous peoples and the Arctic research. They don't feel that the researchers saying, we want to collaborate, but basically it's about scientific colonialization. That word was used a couple of times. And that's a really big thought when you think about this aspect of colonialization, and especially under the context of indigenous populations, which are predominant in the Arctic. Oh my gosh. And they quoted an Arctic leader, Sheila Waclotier. I love her to pieces. I've had the chance to meet and have coffee with her and talk to her. And the quote was like this, and you'll appreciate this, Gareth. She said, researchers are like snow geese. We know what time of year they're going to show up. They're going to eat all the food. They're going to crap everywhere. And then they're going to leave, and we won't hear from them for another year. And that's an aspect of the research cycle. But just think about what that statement says. That statement started to say, and this is where the new part of the research I wanted to follow, is they don't trust each other. The researchers think that they are being trustful. The folks in the community are saying, there's no trust here. There's no empathy for what we're doing. There's no connection for what we're doing. We're being used, not appreciating our traditional knowledge. Now, part of that comes from the aspect of what it is to get tenure. Actually, what an aspect of what it is to get a PhD or a DBA, which is there's an aspect of quant analysis that I have to have. And traditional knowledge is very qualitative. And I'm sitting there thinking, we talk about traditional knowledge and I'm hearing lived experience. And I know you might appreciate that. We've got, Dick Boland and the folks at Case about lived experience and grounded theory research, which is based on lived experience. But lived experience is not quantitative, so it doesn't get published. And if it doesn't get published, you don't get tenure. I mean, it's that simple. So the aspect of scholarly research and publication and tenure gets in the way of addressing the problem. So I'm listening to all this. I'm going, we talk about trust. We throw trust out as a word. Yes, trust is one of the key things. Of course, everybody knows what trust is. The paraphrase Supreme Court Justice, I think it's Stuart Potter, or was it Potter Stewart? I always get confused. He says, I don't know what trust is, but I know it when I see it. And that's what people do. Well, yeah, I know what trust is, but are you asking me to define it? And there are measures that can define it. They talk about a lot of different things. You can see where that goes. So, but my question is, what is trust? How does trust work in this aspect of collaboration? When you're working on a project, that shared vision perhaps is not an important thing. Trust comes into play. But what does that mean? Because sometimes you can't do exactly what you say you were going to do. Isn't that the initial definition of trust? I trust someone because their word is their bond. They'll do what they say. But sometimes it doesn't work out. So it's not just trust, it's trust resilience. And as a mechanical engineer and a fan of system dynamics and system thinking, especially Jay Forrester's work, which I've been following since I was a senior in college, was thin and blonde, and when I read Limits to Growth for the first time, is all about stocks and flows. So what comes in to build a stock of trust? At what point does that stock get high enough of experiences that you have trust? How much of that stock of experience drains out before I don't have trust? And that interim, that difference in the amount of stock of trust you have, that's resilience. Now, what forms resilience? How do we get there? And I cannot tell you how this happened. I really can't. I started to use the term collective ambition. Now, I thought it was, it's about, the class I had with Mohan a case, and I go back to all my notes. Well, it's collective impact, it's collective action. Never once in a whole semester's worth of notes did I see the two words collective and ambition put together. So I'm Googling collective ambition. I'm getting nothing. I'm going, where is this coming from? So maybe it's just, I just created a new term. And by golly, I'm running with it. Because in the classes on organizational behavior and on the text that I'm working on as an online text, I've started to define an organization as a group of people that come together with a collective ambition to do something together they couldn't do individually, which is also the aspect of a team. So if I insert the word collective ambition instead of shared vision, what does that mean? Good question. And that's kind of where I'm pausing. And, again, Ron Fry would say, I would say to Ron, I'm parsing words, and you say, words create worlds, Jim. What does collective ambition mean? How did you instinctively get to that? Well, I started looking at the different parties, and each individual in a party. I was looking at boundary spanning and boundary theory. This is all post-degree, by the way. This is just stuff I'm kind of playing around with. Is that people come with certain expectations. They want to become part of a project or team because they have expectations. It could be as simple as I get new experience, allows me to get a promotion. The project is a benefit to me in this way. The different parties see where the different expectations and benefits come from. Everyone has their own identity. They have their own constraints and expectations. They have essentially their own ambitions. And maybe the word ambition, why it came up subconsciously, is that people are ambitious. They want to accomplish something. So if we can find where those ambitions align, then that's a little bit different story than we all have the same vision. Now, there's some, obviously, kernel here that says we're coming together for a specific reason. Something excites us about that vision. But this feeds our own interior ambitions, our own motivations. The next thing was, if I have the strength of that ambition, if I really see that there's something in this for me, then I can handle some changes that go on. I can withstand that didn't work out as we expected. Someone wasn't able to do what they were supposed to do, but that's okay. So now I'm curious about the strength of the collective ambition versus the ability to trust. So that strength, and it moves between individuals as well, will have different realms as it relates to trust. And without trust, I don't think we're getting to collaboration. We're not getting to innovation. We're not making ourselves vulnerable. for not being able to accomplish things. And it strikes me that projects that have failed in the Arctic and Pacific, large risk-based project, fail or groups come together because the costs are too high, not just in dollars, but in what people will see that they can achieve. And part of this is an aspect of cynicism. People aren't just doing things from an altruistic perspective. There's always some reward that's going in there. I don't know what all this means. I really don't. But the idea of trust and collective ambition, allowing collaboration to evolve and emerge, has truly got my interest. Now, as a side note to this, I know I've been talking for a while, but as a side note to this, someone asked me a couple of months ago if I'd be interested in writing something for a journal on Arctic governance. And again, it was a faculty out of case in their political science department. We had somehow got connected. We're pen pals now. And I said, yeah, I think so. I said, well, what do you think it would be about? And literally the day before she had asked, there was a big, above the fold headline in the local paper about how the current administration had put the permitting process on pause for what's known in Alaska as the Ambler Mining Road Project, which is a 250-mile road from, and you have to understand, in Alaska, there aren't any roads. There's a road from Anchorage to Fairbanks, and that's pretty much it. And that's the rail belt follows that too. And that's pretty much where everything goes. Yeah, we go down to Homer and Seward a little bit. And then there's the, quote, Haul Road, or the Dalton Highway, which is for all the trucks going north, another 400 miles to the North Slope to service the industry. Nothing else exists. All of our rural communities are reached either by water, when the water's during season, or by air, if they have to be. So now we're putting a 200-plus mile road into the interior, into a mining district. It has been ongoing for 10 years. I'm familiar with it because it was in a different group of the organization I was with before I retired, was involved with that in the process. And so I'm hearing all the concerns from most of the local communities on the road. It's been going on for 10 years. And the paper said that, well, it's been withdrawn. And of course, immediately the political outcry, obviously the overreach of the government, it's the Biden administration denying Alaskans what Alaskans should have. But I'm looking at who was part of that process of advocating to the Biden administration to put this on pause, that they thought that their questions were not being answered. And one of them was the Tanana Chiefs Organization, which is not, just a couple of people with aluminum foil on their head. There's a very serious organization doing serious stuff. And I said, there's something there. And I said, I think I want to write on this and what's going on in aspects of trust and collaboration. A week later, I'm on the phone at one of the public meetings, this time one by the state of Alaska on a portion of the road. Same kind of concerns I'm hearing in the voices that I've heard for the last 7 or 8 years. And I asked the question to this group, I said, can you tell me how many trucks per day, to the people that were running this public session meeting, how many trucks a day are moving on the road? And they couldn't answer the question. They said, well, that's not our job. That's, that's on the federal permit. That's not on the state permit. I said, the road crosses indigenous lands, it crosses state lands, it crosses federal lands. Everybody should know how many trucks per day are going on this road and where the ore is going to. And again, I'll make the comment, I'm a fan of this project because it's reaching some of the interior copper resources. And if we, as a world, we want to move to a more renewable, I need to have copper as one of the key strategic minerals that allow us to move from fossil fuels into batteries, into wind, into photovoltaics. There are certain elements there. And this is, of course, quick aside. We talked about driving down roads. To make a switch from a fossil fuel-driven energy source requires another disruptive material source. Mining is problematic, no different than oil drilling is problematic. Oil drilling, in my perspective, production is much safer than mining in terms of the damage it does. But we've seen spills. We've seen the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen the damage these spills can do. Mines tear up a fair amount of the real estate. They're disruptive too. So how do we make these blend? If you want to move to this energy form, which we must if we want to survive, other than simply lowering our consumption, we have to change where that disruption takes place. That said, what became obvious to me, and from being in these meetings, that the public testimony on these roads was just like the researchers. They're just like snow geese. We know when they're going to come up, they're going to take testimony, we're going to tell them all our stories, they're going to cross their arms and nod, then they're going to move on and we won't hear about them or anything about that to the next. No trust. So the case study I'm going to try to write about this is the aspect of trust, the aspect of collaboration. How do we acknowledge building relationships? The process isn't necessarily bad, the process is being followed, but it's very checklist. I have the time for public sessions, we hear public sessions, we react or respond to those comments, and we move on. So the question is, how does this happen? Where is the relationship building? Well, we have to do this. It's going to create this mile and create thousands of jobs. Well, this road's going through a rural community of 100 people. Maybe one person will get a job. The other 99 will say, I'm having to deal with truck traffic. Indigenous traditional knowledge. A woman on the phone said, I've been hunting here for 50 years. I know the migration routes and the hunting routes that we follow for subsistence. I have offered to sit down with the planners and locate the roads so it help them locate the roads that doesn't go through here. They've never once responded to that request. Why would I trust them? So I think as we're moving in projects, especially development projects, we've got to build stronger, start with relationship, start with the collective ambition, start to answer the rudimentary and fairly cynical question, what's in it for me? This is what's in it for you. Part of it maybe I'll negotiate is that you'll get part of the road tariff, and that allows you to do better things in your community. Part of it is that there'll be better telecommunication, which means you might be able to do local industry and your children won't be so anxious to leave the communities. Telemedicine will be stronger. Let's find out where the benefits are and talk to those benefits. And then through this trusting relationship and hearing and actually responding, not just to the native corporations. That's the other thing. Well, the native corporations are involved, and yes, they are, but sometimes there's a little trust between the local communities and the large native corporations as well, because, well, they're suits as well. They may look like us, but they're suits still. There's that kind of aspect in there. It's an interesting dynamic that's taking place. And that's kind of where I'm kind of hoping to get my arms around and ultimately get to the point of why I took the doctorate. I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to learn about how people would work together because I wanted to be able to contribute to making a difference in how projects and work is done in the Arctic. And I wasn't sure what that forum would be, but maybe this paper is that first step, which kind of gets me excited. And, that's kind of where I am, kind of leading on my research.
No, I really do appreciate all that context. And it does sound like, if nothing else, an incredibly affirmative and optimistic and positive first step. And I just think that, I guess in hearing all of this, that the thing I come back to is this idea of trust resilience. And I'd never quite contemplated this concept in quite those terms before. But I guess as someone, for whom none of this is within my wheelhouse, but for whom, someone who grew up in New Zealand, we've always had this, there's always been this kind of state versus indigenous people level friction in terms of exploitation of the environment versus stewardship of the environment. And it's sort of an outsider looking in. I think a lot of people from my neck of the woods, you think about Alaska and that part of the world, you think about energy, And one of the first images that comes up for a lot of people, certainly for people my age or perhaps a little bit older, is something like the Exxon Valdez, like perhaps the most, grim example of things gone awry. And, everything that you said before about, researchers kind of coming in, taking what they need and then zipping off again. This idea of scientific colonialization and scientific imperialism and all of the above. All of what you said sounds tremendously promising and tremendously optimistic. I'm just sort of wondering where the ceiling is in terms of how much trust building is needed to establish some like bedrock level of trust resilience such that this kind of collaboration and this pursuit of collective ambition can take place. I'm just wondering, in general, how much have, say, the indigenous peoples, or like the First Nations peoples of Alaska, how much and how badly have they been burnt over, the course of X number of years? Wind the tape back however far you want. How much work is it going? I mean, I don't doubt the work is going to be hard. I don't doubt that there's a lot of really intensive work ahead of people like yourself to get us there, get us to the point where we can pursue something like collective ambition, where we can have this level of trust resilience. But just how difficult is this work going to be? And what does for you, just perhaps crystal balling it a little bit, let's say, what does the road ahead look like in terms of being able to reestablish or perhaps establish for the first time a baseline level of trust that will be resilient enough such that that the sense of collective ambition can be pursued with all parties on the same page, everyone sort of, if not, not pursuing the same shared vision. I'm sure that the vision is going to be different for different people. There's going to be different expectations and so forth, but collectively gelled enough such that we can make real, tangible progress in these areas.
If I was able to answer that, I'd be in Oslo accepting a Peace Prize and maybe singing a Bob Dylan song or something. I'm not sure which. But there's a lot of work. First off, I think we've got to move away from the aspect of competition. So in Alaska specifically, Canada is actually a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot different. But in Alaska, with the establishment of the North Slope oil fields and the pipeline, what happened was to get that project off a dead center, because the U.S. government and Department of Transportation were sued to stop that project by the peoples of the indigenous peoples of Alaska. And as a result of that, I'm kind of muddling things a little bit. What came into place was the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement Act, which identified that, and this kind of rolls out of statehood in Alaska. Remember, Alaska is a relatively young state in terms of the United States. Its statehood was 1959, I think. So part of that, there was roughly in that statehood act, there were a third of the state acreage was for what ultimately came about. I'm not sure it was right at the beginning, but maybe it was split off. But said, let's just say the remainder, 2/3, were federal. At some point, with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, about half of that became native lands, if you will, defined native lands for different tribal entities. So it was Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And so they own about a third of the lands in the state. That was part of the next step on that. INCSA, Alaska, that's INCSA, and then there was ANILCA. Anyhow, I get confused on the alphabet. If my spousal unit was with me, she would correct me in what I was saying. But what happened was the establishment of native corporations, Siri Corporation, Alaska North Slope Corporation, 12 native corporations and a 13th corporation that represents some of Southeast and some of more Haida and out Native Alaskans that have left the state have their own kind of like small corporation. And these corporations are businesses, big office buildings. And as corporations, they were able to apply for 8A, different government contracts in different ways because they were an 8A corporation. They collect funds, they pay dividends out to their shareholders, the members of that corporation. I know a couple of the folks that were involved in that initial aspect of the corporation and asked the question. They said, we went with the corporation role because that allowed us to compete at a Western level. That we're a company that signs contracts, there's a company that we get paid. And we felt that was better than trying to establish the First Nations identity of tribal rule or sovereignty that Canada does. Now, 40 years or 50 years down the road, they're starting to swing a little bit. There are some folks in Canada saying, boy, I wish we went to the native corporation type aspect. Some folks in Alaska saying, I wish we had the tribal sovereignty. Because still as corporations, we don't have sovereignty over our lands. They're lands, but they're corporate lands. But that was a starting point. But think of it as a starting point. These corporations were created in order to compete with Western corporations. So right off from the get-go, we have a competitive mindset. It was about establishing sovereignty through a corporate rule. So there's a lot to go. But now we need to move to the micro level. Really what it is, we're talking a micro level type approach. And that's where on this road aspect is, that's all well and good that we've got these different tribal corporations. And if you are a member of that corporation, you get a dividend. Some of us live in Alaska, we're not. Some of the tribal, it's still the corporations doing the great thing for profit as the motive. Profit as the motive as opposed to purpose as the motive, because that's what corporations do. So you've got a little bit of Hall in there. And there are things that are being done. And part of this case study will be looking at what the Nana Corporation did as part of their road, how they tended to work with their portion of the region on their lands to establish some kind of a trust, establish what I might be able to define from the evidence of a collective ambition. Now, this aspect of trust that you're talking, I think collective ambition becomes the starting point. Everyone has an ambition. Let's start with getting what we want out of the deal. I mean, kind of work our way through it. At best, we're going to be in a cooperative, negotiated type state, but at least start with those ambitions. At the same time, we need to build the relationships and the shared identities. I don't know that we'll get to true collaboration, but I think we'll move on the scale towards that if we're able to define that. And collaboration and trust is experiential. So until we're able to demonstrate over and over and over and over again where trust is. So building the stock of trust resiliency, but also starts to think about what are the barriers to that, what are the experiences we have to get by. And that's hard. And I can't forecast what that is or how we get to it other than this. We have to try, because if you don't try and start, you're simply not going to get there. You have to take that first step on the journey. The other thing is to look to some of the work as relates to Chris Cameron at Michigan on positive energy and positive leadership, positive organization scholarship, compassion, emotional intelligence. We've got to push those aspects of the emotional intelligence is most of the training, but the aspect of concentrating, building on strengths, appreciative inquiry, building on strengths and positive energy, because if we cannot keep that positive mindset, we will revert back to the fight, flight, or freeze reflex from a neural perspective. We're not going to get any place. And it's just an aspect of, I'm old. There's a part of me that says maybe it's time to retire, but I'm not quite ready for the ice flow yet. And we have to believe in humanity. We have to want to strive for flourishing. And what's heartbreaking is over the last 2 or 3 years how we've just retreated into, or 4 years actually, 5 years, some aspect of tribal isolation across the world politically, from an aspect of power. And I'm pessimistic because of that, but all I can do to proceed is to be positive, because I know we can do things together. And I know there's a way forward. And I know that this is what's important. And we just need to find the group that want to do that.
And look, I know, I'm sure that you will want to keep where I'm going with this conversation as apolitical as I do. But just to linger there for a moment, it's something that I spoke with Ron Fry on my podcast a little while ago, and he kind of made this point, not quite this way, but he was speaking about the idea that, adopting a strengths-based approach, an optimism-oriented approach, what other choice do we have at this point? And, as someone, my wife is American. She's been living out of America for the last few years. She's one of many American expats who looks back, and by no means am I saying that this is, uniquely confined to the United States, but it seems like the most exemplary case of kind of the divisiveness we see in the world right now. She's one of, numerous American expats who looks back at her homeland kind of aghast right now. And I think she's not alone. I know she's not alone in feeling like so much of this at least seems irreconcilable. Like it seems from the outside looking in as unfixable in some sense, that the level of division and the level of hostility and the level of animosity is such that I take your point, like we have to try. We obviously have to start somewhere, but the starting point and the trajectory that we move in, to so many people, these seem so ill-defined and so vague and so such an intractable problem right now. And again, this is not to make it political at all, but it seems like the distance between not just the ideological distance, but experiential distance between people on the far sides of the political spectrum have become so pronounced now that, as an outsider, I just don't see, I can't see, I want to be able to see, and I would like to be able to, cast my gaze wider than my gaze perhaps currently is. Perhaps my gaze currently is just too narrow. But, it's difficult for me to envision just how we get there. I look at everything that comes up, again, not just uniquely confined to the United States, but it just seems like the most striking example. How do we get those people over there and those people over there to arrive at something like a collective ambition where the level of trust is there, or at least the seedlings of trust and belief in each other, collective interest is enough that we can start moving things in the right direction. I mean, I've spoken to enough people from the United States who have, quite cynically, largely washed their hands of the problem. That they've kind of said, well, you know what, I feel like my country is just forever doomed at this point to be untrusting, for these divides and these schisms to be as wide as they are. We are just going to have to kind of talk across this discursive canyon, for the rest of our lives without any real hope of meeting in the middle. So just based on everything that you've said, what piques your interests regarding collaboration and so forth? And I realize, again, if you had a good defined answer for this, you'd be in Oslo right now accepting a Nobel Peace Prize. But where do we start? What does the road ahead kind of look like, even in sort of like relatively let's say imprecise terms, what can be done? What can be done? Perhaps not just for the United States. Call that again the exemplary case. But what can be done in the United States, and how can we maybe extrapolate some of those lessons to the rest of the world, as divided as the rest of the world might be as well?
I'm honored to accept this prize and check from the Nobel Foundation. Gareth, there's a couple things there, and maybe you and maybe I, in some ways. In fact, I just talked to my class about this the other day. That as people that have the opportunity to influence the next generation of business people, this is where we start. And I talked to my class. I said, I'm doing this. I don't have to teach as an adjunct. I'm doing that, and believe me, it's not like I'm doing it for the money. I'm doing this because I think it's important. I'm doing this because partly ego. I believe something that's important to say, and I hope that you might hear some of it. And I'm teaching. I lean in. Every class is leaning in this aspect of building on strengths and positivity. Every aspect of management. The mindfulness meme that I work on is about positive. I believe that collaboration is, in fact, the next management meme. It's not just something that's out there, it's something we need to do. So where does this take us in the great problems of the future? I believe that today, anyhow, in the United States in particular, but not limited to the United States, the UK is there, most of Europe has similar type issues, is that the political, we're at a point where politically, the political vision can take the world forward as one that we would like to think would happen. And while I acknowledge the fact that businesses historically have a bad record in terms of being trustworthy, to lean into case in the Fowler Center, business as an agent of world benefit is where we have to start. The businesses have a certain aspect of what they want to do, and I think they need to understand it from a connecting and a flourishing perspective. The 2019 Business Roundtable aspect saying maybe we've got to consider purpose more than we've considered in the past, and not just derivations or distortions of Friedman's maximizing profits, the only goal of an organization, which he never quite said. That purpose is part of that. Acknowledging our shareholders, those that we affect, is the best and most effective way, cost-effective and efficient way to run a business. And if we do that, then businesses have the opportunity to make this difference. That's tough. That's a tough road to hoe, or a tough road to hoe, I guess, is the right term. The question is it more likely to happen than waiting for a change in the political environment, which we are probably now a generation away from? So to move forward, education, building on people that are, like you, that are significantly younger than I am, that are moving into positions of leadership in a variety of ways. These are who we have to count on. And that's not an abdication, it's just a reality. I think instinctively the reason I came up with collective ambition in the shower, working out, or in the dream, I'm not sure where it came from, is an inherent acknowledgement of who we are as people, as humans, that we all have ambitions, we have things we can accomplish. And I think if we can start with airing our ambitions, what is it that we want? What is it that we'd like to have? Which is kind of a negotiation process. Maybe I pulled it out of some folks from Harvard, Jim Sabanius, and his 3D negotiation. But the aspect here is really, let's find the commonalities of those things we want to accomplish. Now, again, there has to be a kernel of why people come together. So the aspect of a vision, that's what leaders do, they articulate a vision, is still important. but trying to get everyone on board with the shared vision, or on a shared vision, may be simply wrong. It can't be done. But if we air our ambitions, understand our ambitions, share our ambitions, maybe we've got a way forward. In a similar way, I'm starting to parse another word, and that's empathy. Empathy is, you can't have trust without empathy. I'm going, well, I'm not so sure that's the case. Empathy assumes that someone has my best interests in heart. But if I got someone doing the work, a carpenter, a builder, or a contractor, whatever, and they've done it over and over, and I'm trusting them to get it done because of their experience. Not that they care about me, but they have the skills and the track record to do that. So overemphasizing empathy might be a different thing. So I'm moving back to this idea of perspective taking and perspective making as an alternate to the theory of empathy. That we don't really need to be empathetic, but what we really need to do is understand the different perspectives people bring and understand things from their perspective, which is to understand their expectations, understand their constraints, understand their identities, understand their ambitions, is a way of taking perspective. And if we think more about perspectives as opposed to being empathetic, maybe that gives us, again, from the practitioner to the pragmatic, maybe it's because I'm an engineer, it gives us a different role. Yesterday morning, I was in a session, an hour-long session, the Center of Positive Organizations in Michigan, where they have once a month a different researcher gives a paper, and you can sit in there and you can listen, and there's a little Zoom meeting interaction, and it was on compassion and compassion fatigue. That with all that's going on, what does compassion fatigue mean? And if you have more fatigue, compassion fatigue, you're more likely to understand that there's a limit to compassion. Or maybe it was the other way around. If you think that there's a limit to compassion, you're more likely to have compassion fatigue. If you believe that there's no limit to compassion, that being compassionate, however we phrase that, does not mean that you're losing something, that there's plenty of compassion to go around, then you don't have compassion fatigue. That's what some of the studies are showing. So again, how compassion fits into trust, limiting compassion, limiting trust, how much trust do I really give? All those expectations are there. It's tough. If it wasn't, I guess there wouldn't be a market for PhDs in business and organizational psychology, because we run out of things to do. We'd all have to figure it out by now. But I really believe, Ron's point about that, what other choice do we have? We have to take a strength-based approach. And as leaders in business and business education, that has to be our primary goal, is to teach that, to inculcate that into everyone's being.
Yeah, and look, I just think the obverse, just strikes me as just fraught with going nowhere, right? But by definition, if we throw our hands up, assume that it's always going to be in the too hard basket, then of course it will remain embedded, lodged in the too hard basket. And I think it's actually very, very important as well, what you've just said about empathy. I had David O'Reen on my podcast a little while ago. He was talking about the limits of empathy, the sort of upper limits of empathy when it comes to solving managerial and business-oriented problems of consequence. And I go back to Paul Bloom at Yale. His alternative to empathy is this idea of rational compassion. That, there may be, the idea is that we may have significant limits in how much we can truly empathize with other people, in so much as given differences in our background, and perhaps this is especially pertinent with something like First Nations or indigenous peoples versus like those damn researchers coming in, swooping in, taking what they need and leaving again. That's maybe a case, an exemplary case right there of where empathy really doesn't get you that far. But something like rational compassion, like being able to take almost an aloof sort of a quasi third person perspective on what someone else's desires and ambitions might be. That might help go some of the way to getting us on the page towards something like collective ambition in a way for which empathy, its limits become very apparent very quickly a lot of the time, because we don't have shared, it's very hard for me to put myself in the shoes of, say, someone like an indigenous person who has this vested interest, their own vested interests in the land and how the land is used, because it's not my background, and similarly, someone who's drilling oil or something like that, they don't have that background either. So very, very difficult to put yourself in someone's shoes and fully adopt their perspective, which is kind of the technical definition of empathy, is really being able to put yourself in someone else's mind. That's difficult to do when you just don't have that background. So maybe something like, I'm not saying that rational compassion is the antidote to the limits of empathy, as say someone like Paul Bloom has suggested, but it might go some of the way to being able to put us on the same page, and at least focus ourselves in the direction of collective ambition in the way that, empathy, for which empathy perhaps has some striking upper limits.
It's a real good point. I'm going to come back to just kind of reinforce it. I honestly believe that collective ambition is how it's in my mind, without having defined it yet, is the starting point. We can't come together unless we at least understand what our ambitions are and how they work with other ambitions. We just can't even get there. The other thing is that this aspect of rational compassion or empathy, especially from a management rule, part of the perception as well, if you're compassionate, you're going to take it easy on people. If you're empathetic, you're going to give them a break. Well, not necessarily. And that's, I think, that aspect of rational compassion. I do understand and understand your passions, my passions, how they're coming together. I understand what your rules are. That said, here are the constraints that we still have to deal with. But the danger here is that old saw of it's not personal, it's just business. The fact of the matter is, it is all personal. Business is personal. So to say something in a rational, I'm sorry, I have to let you go, it's nothing personal, it's just business. First of all, that devalues someone. And the aspect of value is the better approach would be, the system does not allow us at this point. At this point, I'm sorry, but you have to go, and we're going to do this in a way that is best for you, but it doesn't change the outcome. It is hard on you. I get that. It doesn't change. It just simply doesn't change the end result. So to try to move away from it, I'm sorry, this is tough, to, well, I'm being coldly rational, is part of the problem. That's why people don't trust people, because they don't see where the humanity is. But I'm really interested in writing that down. And I think the first point, you're right, it's the aspect of where does empathy come in play versus perspective. Now, I can't know what you are feeling. I don't have your experience. And this, quite frankly, this covers a lot of territory in the diversity field of things too, the equitability, diversity, inclusion, justice. There's points there that I can't relate to your life experience. I can't. I don't have it. So I can't empathize. But if you can help me, I can try to understand the specific problems and concerns that you have from your perspective that might allow me this aspect of at least understanding your perspective while I can never be empathetic. And that's the first step. So if I'm running a project in this, my first step in this, want to build this road, is simply, I need to know what everyone's concerns are. Let's get them on the table. Let's talk about it. Let's have the relationship building, which tends not to happen in Western cultures. I know when I was working in Singapore, relationships were everything. And my gut tells me in Vietnam, it's a very similar type arrangement. Western society, maybe it's Magna Carta on out, I don't know, has been a series of treaties and contracts. And that transaction tends to be I win, you lose. Of course, in negotiation, they're moving past that as well, which is kind of consistent with the aspect of collaboration. But the old aspect of getting all you can on the contract, because that's what it's about, is the contract, eliminates the possibility of relationships. More than that, it eliminates the possibility of creating any kind of collective ambition or even shared vision from that regard. Although there's some aspect of collective ambition, but collective ambition only works in true negotiation, only works if you can make the pie bigger. If we understand what people need and make sure that what they need, absolutely need, is met versus what they want is met, takes us down a whole other path on conversations and discussions. But it all blends together. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. But I'm sure going to still try to understand it, find out. That's for sure.
Well, James, I mean, that right there is probably as good a place to wrap things up. And just to say that, I mean, look, 2 years from now, you and I might be standing side by side on that stage in Oslo. Perhaps we take these next 2 years and we actually figure out what makes all the difference. I mean, I know it's like sort of an oft overused dichotomy, so the difference between mere transactionalism and actual transformation, but I suspect it's going to have to be something approximating the latter, because the former, from my pea-brain point of view, is not going to get us there. I mean, I think it, I think it goes beyond, before the Magna Carta, before the Nicene Creed. I think we have had this, at least in the West, this sort of civilizational rollout of virtual zero sum. Someone has to lose, and that to me just does not seem sustainable.
It isn't, and we've got to move beyond that before we have that sharing of the stage.
Absolutely. Well, we will get there, and I will be there renting my tuxedo right alongside you. But Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom, share your experience, and more than anything, to just share your aspirations, because everything you've shared with me today has really had an aspirational quality to it. And to go back to something I was saying earlier, that really is the only choice we have, right? We have to have this focus where we can do better, that doing better is a real possibility, to operate from this position of strength, of ambition. To do otherwise would, I think, be an abdication. It would be like defaulting to it really would be sort of just defaulting to a mean that we can no longer sustain. So I just appreciate you sharing those aspirations with me, and a little bit about your background and where the future lies for you. I wish you all the best and every success with that, not only with that case, but with your wider projects in life. I know your students are going to be very, very lucky to be receiving your wisdom and all the insights you've accumulated over your career. And just again, wishing you every success in the future to come.
You're the best, my friend. Fist bump.
Fist bump. All right, brother. Well, take care. It's been great talking to you, and all the best with that upcoming Alaska winter. I'm sitting here looking at it's 7 degrees Celsius outside here in New Zealand, and that's a little too cold for my liking. I know it'll be more like -15, -20 territory in a few months' time in the frozen north. So, but I'm sure you are more than acclimated to those winters. So. Yeah, enjoy that. Enjoy that upcoming snow season.
One can only hope it doesn't turn into a freezing rain season. Again, we've all seen the difference in climate and weather patterns, and they're just all over the map. Just have a lot of coats handy. That's my motto.
Yep. Well, we'll have them handy in Oslo, that's for sure.
Be well. Thanks, Garrett.
Take care. Appreciate it.